Henry Kissinger, the most powerful U.S. diplomat of the Cold War era, who helped Washington open up to China, forge arms control deals with the Soviet Union, and end the Vietnam War, but who was also reviled by critics over human rights, has died at 100. Kissinger, a German-born Jewish refugee whose career took him from academia to diplomacy and who remained an active voice in foreign policy into his later years, died at his home in Connecticut on Wednesday. His geopolitical consulting firm, Kissinger Associates, said. Kissinger was at the height of his powers during the 1970s in the middle of the Cold War when he served as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State under Republican President Richard Nixon. After Nixon's resignation in 1974 amid the Watergate scandal, he remained a diplomatic force as Secretary of State under Nixon's successor, President Gerald Ford. Kissinger was an architect of the U.S. diplomatic opening with China, landmark U.S.-Soviet arms control talks, expanded ties between Israel and its neighbors, and the Paris Peace Accords with North Vietnam. While many hailed Kissinger for his brilliance and statesmanship, others branded him a war criminal for his support for anti-communist dictatorships, especially in Latin America. In his latter years, his travels were circumscribed by efforts by some countries to arrest or question him about past U.S. foreign policy. Democratic U.S. President Joe Biden waited nearly 24 hours after the announcement of Kissinger's death to issue a statement saying that they often strongly disagreed, but Kissinger's fierce intellect and profound strategic focus was evident. Earlier, Biden's national security spokesperson John Kirby said of Kissinger, "Whether you saw eye to eye with him on every issue, there's no question that he shaped foreign policy decisions for decades, and he certainly had an impact on America's role in the world." Kissinger won the 1973 Nobel Peace Prize for ending U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, but it was one of the most controversial ever. 2 Nobel Committee members resigned over the selection as questions arose about the secret U.S. bombing of Cambodia. North Vietnamese diplomat Le Duc, though selected to share the award, declined it. As tributes poured in from around the world, Beijing called him a good old friend of the Chinese people who made historic contributions to normalizing relations between the two countries. Russian President Vladimir Putin praised Kissinger as a wise and far-sighted statesman, while Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said his meetings with Kissinger provided a masterclass in statesmanship. Bangladeshi Foreign Minister Abdul Momen, however, recalled Kissinger's role in the bloody 1971 war between West and East Pakistan that eventually led to East Pakistan becoming an independent Bangladesh. Henry Kissinger has been an iconic diplomat, but unfortunately in 1971 he was dead against the people of the then East Pakistan, Momen told WION News. This is very sad for such a smart man to do such inhumane things. He should have apologized to the people of Bangladesh for what he has done. With his distinctive German-accented voice, Kissinger was never shy to offer his opinion. Ford called him a super secretary of state, but also noted his prickliness and self-assurance, saying, "Henry, in his mind, never made a mistake. He had the thinnest skin of any public figure I ever know," Ford told an interviewer shortly before his death in 2006. Current U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said few people were better students of history, and even fewer people did more to shape history than Henry Kissinger, while Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin called him a rare scholar turned strategist. Heinz Alfred Kissinger was born in Fürth, Germany on May 27, 1923, and moved to the United States with his family in 1938 before the Nazi campaign to exterminate European Jewry. Anglicizing his name to Henry, Kissinger became a naturalized U.S. citizen in 1943 and served in the army in Europe in World War II and attended Harvard University on a scholarship where he earned a doctorate in 1954 and stayed on the faculty for the next 17 years. During much of that time, Kissinger served as a consultant to government agencies, including in 1967 when he acted as an intermediary for the State Department with North Vietnam. He used his connections with President Lyndon Johnson's Democratic administration to press on information about peace negotiations to the Nixon camp. When Nixon's pledge to end the Vietnam War helped him win the 1968 presidential election, he brought in Kissinger as National Security Advisor. But the process of Vietnamization, shifting the burden of the war from U.S. forces to the South Vietnamese, was long and bloody, punctuated by massive U.S. bombing of North Vietnam, the mining of North's harbors, and the bombing of Cambodia. Kissinger declared in 1972 that peace is at hand in Vietnam, but the Paris Peace Accords signed in January 1973 were little more than a prelude to the final communist takeover of the South 2 years later. In 1973, in addition to his role as National Security Advisor, Kissinger was named Secretary of State, giving him unchallenged authority in foreign affairs. An intensifying Arab-Israeli conflict launched Kissinger on his first shuttle mission, a brand of highly personal, highly pressured diplomacy for which he became famous. 32 days of shuttling between Jerusalem and Damascus helped Kissinger forge a long-lasting disengagement agreement between Israel and Syria in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. In an effort to diminish Soviet influence, Kissinger reached out to his chief communist rival, China, and made 2 trips there, including a secret one to meet with Premier Zhou Enlai. The result was Nixon's historic 1972 summit in Beijing with Chairman Mao Zedong and the eventual formalization of relations between the 2 countries. Former U.S. Ambassador to China Winston Lord, who served as Kissinger's special assistant, called his former boss a tireless advocate for peace, saying America has lost a towering champion for the national interest. As Secretary of State, Kissinger went with Ford in 1974 to Vladivostok in the Soviet Union, where the president met Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev and agreed to a basic framework for a strategic arms pact. The agreement capped Kissinger's pioneering efforts at détente that led to an easing of U.S.-Soviet tensions. But Kissinger's diplomatic skills had their limits. In 1975, he was blamed for failing to persuade Israel and Egypt to agree to a second-stage disengagement in the Sinai. And in the India-Pakistan War of 1971, Nixon and Kissinger drew heavy criticism for tilting toward Pakistan. Kissinger was heard calling the Indians bastards, as a remark he later said he regretted. Like Nixon, he feared the spread of left-wing ideas in the Western Hemisphere, and his actions in response led to a deep distrust of Washington by many Latin Americans for years to come. In 1970, he plotted with the CIA on how to best topple the Marxist, democratically elected Chilean President Salvador Allende, and in a memo after Argentina's coup in 1976, he said that the military dictators should be encouraged. When Ford lost to Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, in 1976, Kissinger's days in government were largely over. The next Republican in the White House, Ronald Reagan, distanced himself from Kissinger, viewing him as out of step with his conservative constituency. After leaving government, Kissinger set up a high-priced, high-powered consulting firm in New York, which offered advice to the world's corporate elite. He served on company boards and various foreign policy and security forums, wrote books, and became a regular media commentator on international affairs. After the September 11, 2001 attacks, President George W. Bush picked Kissinger to head an investigative committee. But outcry from Democrats who saw a conflict of interest with many of his consulting firm's clients forced Kissinger to step down. He remained active late in life, attending meetings in the White House, publishing a book on leadership, and testifying before a Senate committee about North Korea's nuclear threat. In July 2023, he made a surprise visit to Beijing to meet Chinese President Xi Jinping. Divorced from his first wife, Anne Fletcher, in 1964, he married Nancy McGaines, an aide to New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, in 1974. He had 2 children by his first wife. A memorial service will take place in New York, and Kissinger will be buried in Arlington National Cemetery, just outside Washington, said a source familiar with the engagements.